Head of AP for the debate moderator. This is how it reads. Fox News' Chris Wallace worked hard Wednesday to keep the final presidential debate substantive with tough questions to Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, but the simplest of queries extracted the biggest headline. That is the first paragraph of the Associated Press. It says a lot. Charles Krauthammer is a syndicated columnist and Fox News contributor. Charles, your thoughts on this debate?
Well, the consensus is right, number one, that Chris Wallace is the big winner. That was the best moderator performance I've ever seen. He actually conducted a substantive debate, which I don't think anybody's been able to do in this cycle, all alone, without his usual wingman. And he did it in a way that allowed them to actually have long discussions without interruption. That is very hard to do and very rare, as anyone who's done it knows. Now, as to the candidates, Trump had a really good night, but here the consensus is right. He blew it up by a totally wrong answer on accepting the results. And in some sense, I almost admire him for it. This was not a gaffe where you say something off the cuff and it's what you think, but it's wrong. You know that he'd been coached on this. You know that his vice president had said, of course, we will accept the result, and his campaign manager and his daughter. And you know that he's convinced that this is something he wants to take a stand on. And the calculation, this is political suicide. Because what was his task tonight? His task tonight was to stop the slide. The slide had to do with people who are grudgingly going over to Clinton, who don't want to, have held out for a year, but for the last 3 weeks said, I can't have Trump. This was his opportunity to show them they're not going to change their views on Clinton, but if they could change their views on Trump to make him less toxic and acceptable as president and less radical. Yes, they want a change agent. They think the country's on the wrong track, but they don't want a radical who will challenge the foundations of the republic. Yes, you criticize conditions, you're going to change Washington, etc., but you don't challenge the legitimacy of an election and hold up the prospect of actual non-acceptance. And when he did that, I think it was a terrible mistake.
This was Donald Trump channeling Steve Bannon, not channeling Kellyanne Conway.
And he, right.
Messaging.
And the reason it's damaging is because up until then, I thought he was winning the debate. This is the first time and the first debate that he's won on points, on logic, on being able to make a case, on bringing up stuff. And he's had a lot of new material, much of it ignored by the mainstream media over the last 3 weeks. And he got a lot of it in there, especially when he brought up the WikiLeaks stuff. And she walked into a trap saying that he had encouraged the violence in his campaign, a terrible mistake on her part, because the obvious answer was, how can you say that when it was instigated by your own people? So he was nimble. He was relaxed. At the beginning, he was so soft-spoken. I thought he should have had a drug test. But he was very calm and contained. There were a lot of interjections which I thought were bad and sort of diminished him on the temperament issue. But until then, I think he could have walked away with a win. And unfortunately, as you read all these headlines, that is not how it's going to be seen. Nobody remembers. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's interesting that this whole process started with Donald Trump and that first debate in Cleveland in August of last year. The very first question was, raise your hand if you pledge, you know, just to not run.
Support. To support the nominee.
As an independent, and you're right. And he didn't raise his hand. And
I thought that you're absolutely right.
It was the same kind of thing. But Bill Bennett, Charles, was saying, we're going to make too much a deal out of this, and that he's just essentially saying, I'm not going to make my decision up until the election comes.
I think your analogy is exactly right. It reminded me exactly of that. And he must have been thinking, remember, he got booed. It was you who asked the question. And remember, he got booed by the audience. Nonetheless, he began to shoot up in the polls. It did not cost him, as most of us thought. I'm sure his calculation is it's not going to cost him, and it's going to help him. I don't understand that calculation. But I do think he said it out of conviction. He's a man who says, I'm not a loser. So if he does lose, it's got to be something else. But I think he's miscalculated here, and it will likely show.
Charles Krauthammer, as always, thank you.